scholarship on Haiti. Well, in both parts of Hispaniola, Wilson's intervention left a bitter legacy, incomparably worse in Haiti, and before our eyes right now, in vivid and horrifying detail. It can hardly escape notice that the devastating catastrophe in Haiti in January, like many others, is sharply class-based. The small, Europeanized, wealthy elite, some just European, they didn't emerge unscathed, but the really horrendous tragedy was in the miserable urban slums to which people had fled from the ruined countryside. That contrast, which was sharp enough, was heightened by the impact of the earthquake a few weeks later in Chile. It was 500 times the magnitude of the Haitian earthquake, but with a fraction of the toll of the Haitian catastrophe, in part because of Chile's solid building standards and the radical difference in wealth quite generally. Now, there's no great secret as to how Haiti became a global symbol of misery and despair. It was France's richest colony and the source of much of France's wealth. And by 1789, it was producing 75% of the world's sugar, and it was the world leader in production of cotton, which is kind of the oil of the early Industrial Revolution, and many other valuable commodities. Well, apart from its human consequences, the slave-based plantation society that was imposed by French imperial violence undermined the fragile ecology. Haiti did liberate itself at a terrible cost. In 1804, it established the first free society of free men in the hemisphere, and it struck fear into the hearts of the civilized world, particularly the slave state nearby, which refused even to recognize Haiti until 1862, when the U.S. also recognized Liberia, and for the same reason. The Emancipation Declaration raised concerns about how to rid ourselves of inferior people, and the reigning doctrine was transfer them to where they belong. That project was actually abandoned a few years later when new and even harsher modes of slavery were introduced. It's a central factor in the U.S. Industrial Revolution and a chapter of American history that's too little known. Well, by then the U.S. took over from France, and the travails of Haiti continued. Wilson's invasion was the most destructive blow. In particular, Wilson's restoration of a semi-plantation economy impelled further the flight of poor peasants to urban slums. That process was accelerated sharply under Reagan in cooperation with the World Bank, again following the most progressive policies and the dictates of the most advanced economic theory. The idea was that they were going to help Haiti pursue its comparative advantage of work in U.S.-owned assembly plants under miserable conditions, mostly women stitching baseballs and sewing clothes, and they should abandon agricultural production to U.S. agribusiness. All very rational. In a further act of benevolence, the U.S. in the 80s compelled Haitians to destroy their domestic pigs, hardy pigs, a solid base for the peasant economy, and they were to replace them with pigs from Iowa that required lavish care that far exceeded the resources of their new Haitian owners. Another blow to the economy. The proclaimed goal was to turn Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean. Now, in the same years, deprived of the tutelage of U.S. and World Bank experts, Taiwan followed the opposite course. It located labor-intensive industry in the rural areas to stimulate growth and demand and to prevent migration to urban areas. And it succeeded brilliantly. Taiwan became Taiwan. Haiti sank deeper into misery. The final blow was administered by Clinton. After several years of supporting brutal military terror, Clinton permitted the elected president to return, but on a condition, namely that he accept the policies of the U.S. candidate in the 1990 election, who had been roundly defeated as a result of remarkable grassroots organizing in the hills and the slums, again striking terror into the heart of the emperor. Clinton's condition for restoration of the rule of the vast majority was that Haiti must not impose any import duties, once again in compliance with the most advanced economic theory. The consequences were predicted right away by U.S. government analysts, released studies showing that what remained of Haitian agriculture would be destroyed. Haitian rice farmers are efficient, but they can't possibly compete with U.S. agribusiness, which gains much of its profits from the lavish government subsidies designed by the free market enthusiasts of the Reagan administration. And as predicted, Haiti lost the capacity to feed itself. More peasant families fled to the miserable urban slums where survival is barely possible under normal conditions. There's no time to fill in the remaining gaps, but they're more or less the same. The result, the catastrophe we're now witnessing, but witnessing without historical memory, very crucial in an imperial state, without historical memory or without recognition of what our role in the catastrophe would lead decent people to do, and surely without memory of the significant contribution of Wilsonian idealism. Well, Wilson's famed for his dedication to self-government, but as he explained, it had limits. He said it did not apply to people at a low level of civilization who must be given friendly protection, guidance, and assistance by the colonial powers that had tended to their needs in earlier days. You look at his famous 14 points, they held that in questions of sovereignty, quoting, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined, that is the colonial ruler. Particularly needing our protection and guidance were those whose resources we wanted. By Wilson's day, it was becoming clear that oil would be of prime significance for the military and the future economy generally. Accordingly, Wilson expelled the British from Venezuela, which by 1928 had become the world's leading oil exporter, with U.S. companies now in charge. To achieve that goal, Washington actively supported the vicious and venal regime of Juan Vicente Gomez, violating its open door policy in order to achieve U.S. economic hegemony in Venezuela by pressuring its government to bar British concessions. I'm quoting the standard scholarly study by Stephen Rabe. At home, Wilson's idealism took the form of a Red Scare that was the worst attack on elementary civil rights in American history. Now, it might be thought that the historical record would pose some problems for the imagery of benevolent exceptionalism that's diligently constructed within the culture of imperialism. But as among the current emperor's predecessors, this is hardly so. It's just kind of interesting to see how Wilson scholarship deals with this dilemma. The field's too vast to even try to sample seriously, but you can get some of the flavor of it from the current issue of the leading British international affairs journal called International Affairs. It features several, just came out a couple weeks ago, features several scholarly articles on the Wilsonian heritage in American foreign policy. Now, the method adopted in these studies, I'll quote, is a close examination of how a close examination of how the various ideas bundled together within the concept of Wilsonianism emerged in Wilson's own statements. And there follows a sophisticated analysis of Wilson's statements as they varied in reaction to changing circumstances, and of how the ideological version of Wilsonianism has been invoked to justify actions in later years. And there are a couple of illustrations. One of them is the work of political scientist Tony Smith on what he calls America's mission, exalting Reagan as the most Wilsonian of all presidents since Wilson's time. Another example is the resort to democracy promotion as the rationale for U.S. Middle East policy under George W. Bush. The scholarly inquiry omits to observe that democracy promotion became the grand rationale only well after the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That provided the wrong answer to what Bush, Blair, and other worthies had stressed was the single question that motivated the invasion. Wrong answer, needed something new. The transformation of rationale from self-defense to altruistic idealism passed virtually without notice, except among Iraqis. There were U.S. polls among Iraqis. They dismissed the new rationale as an absurdity, perhaps since they had the misfortune of living the experience. Well, a notable feature of these studies on Wilsonian idealism is that the facts of history are scrupulously ignored. It's a very wise decision in favor of detailed examination of rhetoric and statements. Now, if facts were permitted into the discourse, we would quickly discover that there's considerable merit in Tony Smith's description of Reagan as the most Wilsonian of presidents since Wilson's time. But that course leads to dangerous turf, best avoided. Kinda and other victims, far too numerous to mention, don't have the luxury of the intentional ignorance that's one of the prerogatives of power and privilege and one of the foundations of our intellectual culture. As you know, a major theme of Ed Said's impressive work was the responsibility of intellectuals. Intellectual is kind of an honorific term. It has nothing to do with the quality of what they say or anything like that. It's a term that we use for people who have a sufficient share of privilege so that they're able to speak publicly about human affairs. Privilege, of course, confers responsibility. History, naturally, is written by intellectuals, so their own role often appears attractive, even heroic, and for a marginal few, that's correct. But the true record is pretty grim, back to the earliest days of recorded history. And if that tradition persists, and if we otherwise persist on our current course, today's critical issues will not have to be contemplated by the beetles and bacteria that may inherit the earth before too long. Thanks.
About 20 minutes or so, time for questions. So,
Are there microphones?
we might not have microphones.
Okay, if there aren't any, I'll have to ask you to stand here because I can't hear very well, so you'll translate them for me. Yeah, okay.
Yes, go ahead.